Picture this world in a moment. Freeze it all in a single glass eye.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to go back a little bit before the creation of the superhero, just to give you a quick deep dive into the history of comic books and publishing and all that. Comic books evolved from cartoon strips. So back in the early 30s, and even before that, going back to 1880, 1890, you had newspapers with cartoon strips, 4-panel, 5-panel, whatever the case, and they would tell short sequential stories. Basically, more people were buying the newspaper to read the cartoons than they were buying the newspaper to read the articles. Part of the reason is because people weren't particularly all that literate back in 1880, 1890, even up through the 1920s. All right. So they would go to school. Eventually, they would learn to read and write. It's easier to read a comic. It just is. So what they found out is if they took all the cartoon strips from the month and they put them in one magazine and sold that at the newspaper stand, that they could make a buttload of money, ungodly amount of money. And when they did this, they're like, well, if they'll buy this, they should buy original stuff that they haven't read even more. So what was originally magazines that were like detective stories and stuff without drawings, I mean, there might be an illustration here or there, started to become stories about, basically gangsters and guys fighting gangsters. And you'll see some of that as we go along. Now, the very first superhero was Superman. And you can tell that because, well, the word super is in superhero. Superman was the first one, made an ungodly amount of money. And if you have this comic book over here on the left, and it's in good condition, could be worth $3.2 million. Yep, I'll say it again, $3.2 million. Superman first came out in 1938. That's when he first appeared. The problem was they shopped Superman, Siegel and Schuster, the two gentlemen that created Superman, for about 5 years. Originally, he was a bad guy. He ended up, they did a flop on the story, or they switched him around. They made him the good guy. He was not as powerful when he came out in 1938 as he is today. He wasn't bulletproof per se. He could just he was faster than a speeding bullet, so he'd catch him. He couldn't fly, but he could leap as high as a tall building. And over the years, they made him more and more powerful. Superman made an unbelievable amount of money for Detective Comics, which later would just drop the Detective Comics name and become DC Comics. All right. So that is the beginning of everything for the superhero. Within a year, Bob Kane decided he needed a character to make him the kind of money that he saw the comic book company getting with Superman. And so he originally came up with the idea of a Robin Hood type character who would have a vest and a yellow cape, and that all fell apart when he saw this drawing, or a drawing of this Leonardo da Vinci hang glider. Now, you can pretty much guess what character he created, and I'll let you guess in the chat if you want to. But this character was based on other characters that had come before him. There was a character known as the Black Bat, and he had a cape, and he had guns, and he would fight basically gangsters and criminals. And there was a character known as the Shadow, who would fight men who had evil hearts, and he would hide in the darkness, and he had guns. Bob Kane ended up creating Batman in 1939. And if you think about it, that was 81 years ago. That was a long time ago. Batman, for the first 5 comics, had guns. He would shoot bad guys, and mommies got mad that he would shoot bad guys. So they took his guns away and made him a tougher character and basically made him a more interesting character because he had to be smart enough and dangerous enough to fight a person with a gun and win. Right? Other characters from Batman's background also came from different sources. There was a comic book known as Miss Fury about a woman who dressed like a cat and robbed people. And she was neither a good character nor a bad character. Well, she leaned more toward bad with the robbing thing, but she'd steal from bad guys. Eventually, that would be flipped around and that would create Catwoman based off of Miss Fury. Now, they didn't get sued, but I think if that had happened today, they probably would have got sued. And then Joker was created after somebody was playing a game of cards and looked at the Joker in the cards and went, this could be a Batman character. Boom, there he was. All right, let's move on. Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston and the artist Harry G. Peter. Marsden was a very interesting guy, and he wrote a letter to DC claiming that there were no positive role models for young girls with these superheroes like Superman and Batman. And DC said, well, write one. And Marsden went, all right. Interestingly enough, Marsden was the creator of the lie detector machine. That's actually what he did for a living. He created stuff. He made the lie detector. Wonder Woman ended up with a magic lasso. Now, Wonder Woman is a very controversial character if you go back into the 1930s and even the 40s, because every page had a panel that looked a lot like the one on the right. While she was a warrior princess, there was always some picture where somebody was tied up or chained or being made submissive. Wonder Woman was the highest selling comic book to soldiers during World War II. I'm going to leave that right where that stands. Okay, moving on. First corporate takeover. Captain Marvel, or the first Captain Marvel, was created by C.C. Beck and Bill Parker. And he had all the powers, all the wisdom of Solomon, and the strength of Hercules, and the stamina of Atlas, and the speed of Mercury. Basically, every letter in his name stood for an old god. And DC Comics complained because Captain Marvel started making a ton of money that Captain Marvel was a ripoff of Superman. Now, Superman is a science-based character. Captain Marvel, a magic-based character. Captain Marvel's young boy says the word Shazam, turns into a grown man. It was a lighter comic book. It could sometimes be very silly. Sometimes the bad guys would be a worm, a really smart worm. But somehow DC saw this as a threat, and they actually won the lawsuit. After they won the lawsuit, C.C. Beck and Bill Parker had a lot of bills to pay. So they offered to rent Captain Marvel from C.C. Beck and Bill Parker, and they started publishing Captain Marvel in DC Comics. This rent went back and forth for, I don't know, 40, 30, 50 years, a long time. And by the 1980s, they had just bought Shazam outright. The reason Captain Marvel is called Shazam is back in the 60s, Marvel Comics said, you know, it'd be really cool if we had a character named Captain Marvel because we're Marvel Comics. And the other people sitting around the office said, well, we can't do that. DC owns that. And the guy said, do they? Do they really? So they looked up. The name Captain Marvel had never been copywritten before. So Marvel Comics went, well, we got to do that. So they went and they copywrote the name Captain Marvel. And then they created a character, Captain Marvel. And then DC tried to sue them. And then DC lost because nobody had copywritten the name. And that's why you hear Shazam called Shazam instead of Captain Marvel. It's corporate takeover of the character, eventually a corporate takeover of the name, more or less. Other 1940s characters, Captain America, from Timely Comics, which eventually would just change its name to Marvel Comics, are the first character of the World War I characters that would come back into the 60s and kind of have a new life 20 years later. There were other characters that were in World War II that were created for World War II that ended up eventually coming. Submariner, he ended up coming into the regular continuity, being brought back to life. The Human Torch, and a couple other ones, much lesser known ones, but other characters from the 40s that were created by Jack Kirby ended up being used again at Marvel. What happened between the 40s and the 60s? GIs were reading a lot of these comics, a lot of soldiers. And after the war, they didn't want to read comics about superheroes anymore. They were done. They wanted to worry about their lawn, about barbecuing, about how much wear and tear was on their tires. And so they just kind of let comic books fade away. And for a long time, really, there was only Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman that kind of made it as comic book characters from World War II up to the 60s. But they had goofy comics. They had comics like Win a Trip to the Batcave and Lois Lane and Superman Have a Baby. They weren't really superhero stories anymore. All right, let's spring ahead to what revitalized comics after World War II. So in this 20-year period, you had the type of comics that were popular were horror comics, things about, serial killers or about monsters. There were comics about cowboys. There were comics called True Romance. Things like Casper the Friendly Ghost, Hot Stuff, The Little Devil, Wendy the Witch, Archie, Sabrina, all stuff that was not really superhero based. Stan Lee started out as a coffee boy, 16 years old, bringing coffee to the people who ran Timely Comics, or ran the whole publishing thing, because Timely published a bunch of stuff, not just comics. And every day he was on time, and he was a hard worker, and he was in a meeting delivering coffee one day. And somebody said, well, who's going to head the comic book division? And none of the guys in the publishing house wanted to handle the comic book division. They consider it kid stuff. It was stupid to them. And finally they said, well, why don't you just let Stanley, the coffee boy, run the comics division? And the owner was like, sure, why not? I'm still paying him nothing or next to nothing. He might as well run the comic book division. So for 20 years, he ran the comic book division between 1940 and 1962, or 1942 and 62. And hated it, hated telling people he was a comic book writer, and hated telling people he was an editor for comic books, and really wanted to do movies. And so he decided he was going to quit. And his wife said, before you quit, do one comic book the way you would want to do a comic book, like the way you would want to do a movie. And he went, well, no, they're not going to like that. And his wife said, so what? You're quitting anyway. Okay. And he created the Fantastic Four, first family of comics. And it was a hit. He created it with Jack Kirby, the guy there on the left. Kirby is instrumental to just about every Silver Age Marvel comic book character, because Kirby was incredibly fast and incredibly talented artist. So the team of them would go on to create all these comics that like the Avengers and Iron Man and Hulk and the Fantastic Four. Eventually, Stan Lee would also create Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, and Jack Kirby would move on and do the New Gods and the Eternals and that kind of stuff. So with a hit on his hands, he decided to come up with other characters. He always hated the idea of a teenage sidekick. So he said, why don't we just have a character that's a teenager? And he created Spider-Man. Now, the big difference between DC characters and Marvel characters. Marvel characters have real lives as much as a comic book character can have a real life. Spider-Man has homework. Spider-Man has girl problems. Spider-Man has money problems. I don't know why Spider-Man has money problems. He created that webbing. He could patent that and sell that to construction companies and be a billionaire like Bruce Wayne. But why he hasn't done that is completely beyond me. He's obviously very bright. Marvel characters have pathos, they have drama, they have issues. DC comic characters are princesses like Wonder Woman, are news reporters like Clark Kent, or are millionaires like Batman. So it's very hard for the average person to go, if I were with Superman or if I was Batman, you don't have the cash. Or if you were Wonder Woman, you're not a princess from a magical island. But you could hope for a scientific accident where you get bit by a spider. I know, that seems crazy too. All right, let's talk about characters who've changed a little bit over the time. The Hulk. What looks different about this Hulk and the Hulk you are used to seeing? Anybody, throw it in the chat. How's that Hulk look different? Yeah, he's gray. Hulk is supposed to be green. He didn't start out green. Stan Lee was worried that if he made him green, there would be too many similarities between the Hulk and Frankenstein. Because if you take a look at his head, it's pretty flat, right? They had problems, though. The printing techniques of the early 60s weren't as good as they are today. So when you would look at the Hulk and he would be gray and he would be standing against a gray building, he would kind of blend into the building like he was supposed to be invisible. And then sometimes the gray ink, yeah, the other one does look a little like Frankenstein. Sometimes the gray ink would actually print green because it had a green base in it mixed with other stuff to make it darker. So after a year, Stan Lee was like, I'm so unhappy with how this is printed. Let's just have him get hit with some more gamma radiation and it'll turn him green. And that's how the Hulk ended up green. The reality of the Hulk is a combination of two characters, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and kind of Frankenstein with the crazy strength. And that's exactly where Stan Lee got his ideas. And every time he needed a reason for a character to have a power, he would just open up a magazine called Popular Science and he'd read a few articles and he'd be like, gamma radiation, I bet that would give you powers. Radioactive spider, it'll give you powers. Yeah, it'll probably give you cancer. in the Marvel context, it's going to give you superpowers. All right. Avengers #4, you see the Submariner come back. I'm pretty sure you will see the Submariner in the next 5 years and in the next Black Panther movie, probably as a anti-hero fighting Black Panther. And then he'll become a semi-good guy because he'll be popular. All right, let's talk about some characters who have been drastically changed. All right, back during the war, there are characters that came in just to make money because, you know, fighting Nazis and fighting the Japanese was on everybody's mind and it was popular to write about. As we take a look at this issue of Daredevil from the 40s, the way they have portrayed a Japanese man is not particularly correct or non-offensive. It's pretty offensive. Daredevil had a really high popularity for about 11 issues. After 11 issues, war was over, couldn't sell a single one. So they just got rid of him. He never came back. Part of the reason I think he didn't come back is that belt he is wearing is insane. If your arm swung back to your side, you would cut your wrist. So that's a bad design or a design flaw in him. Now, he was mute. He was a superhero that could not speak. Years later, roughly about 25 years later, Stan Lee creates Daredevil, who is a character who's blind, completely different than Daredevil, who has a boomerang, but has his own weapons, and ends up creating a character that we now have a TV series based on. So sometimes they even recycle names. All right, let's talk about some big moments for comic books. The Spirit, although it came out in the late 30s, early 40s, it was about a man, a former police officer, that almost got beat to death by the mob in the middle of a cemetery. He was found by this little guy here in the middle whose name was Ebony, nursed back to health. Since everyone assumed he was dead, he would put on this mask and he'd go beat up people, and then they couldn't threaten his family because they didn't know who he was. The Spirit is kind of dumb as a stump. Ebony, absolute genius. This is part of the reason I hate the movie so much, is the character of Ebony was actually written out of the movie, and then they messed with the movie. It was the storyline was just garbage. But Ebony was the first positively portrayed Black person in comic books. Even though obviously they drew him fairly racist, he was the smartest person in the book. He always knew what was going on. And there's actually a thing called an Eisner Award, because Will Eisner created the Spirit, about excellence in writing and fairness in writing and that sort of thing. So that was the beginning of what we start to see as Black people in comic books. Unfortunately, over the years, every time they threw a Black person in a comic book, they threw the word Black in front of their name, which is weird. It's just, Black Panther, okay, I'll let that one pass. Black Goliath, didn't need to, At least the Falcon was Red Falcon for a while. But when you get to the 70s, they finally realized that just putting the word Black in front of everything isn't particularly a great idea. And they create a character by the name of Power Man. And he ends up teaming up with Iron Fist. So he basically is the lead character in a duo comic book, and another one that they have created a TV show based on. So equality gets a little bit better come the 1970s. Also in the 1970s, you see the retooling of the X-Men book, which originally came out in the 60s. But by the 70s, they start adding characters from Africa who are Black, characters from Ireland, Banshee, Nightcrawler, German, Colossus, which is Russian, and you start to get like the United Nations all in one team, a culturally diverse team. You even have Wolverine, who is Canadian. Wolverine, when he came out, did not have claws. Well, they thought they were claws in his glove. That's really how he had originally been designed. And if it wasn't for Chris Claremont going, no, let's make his claws pop out of his hands, Wolverine would still be walking around with just claws on his hands. All right. Now, with all that said, almost everybody who worked in comic books got paid a salary. Bob Kane, who created Batman, did not. He retained the rights to Batman. And within a year, Batman was making him enough money that he hired a person to draw it and another person to write it. And he lived in a penthouse like Bruce Wayne. I mean, he really did just end up being like Bruce Wayne without going out and beating up bad guys at night. So there was a ton of money to be made. Unfortunately, the two gentlemen who created Superman, Siegel and Schuster, sold the rights to Superman for $250. There's a lot of money back in the late 30s. But Superman is a $1 billion character. He is literally worth $1 billion. So it was probably a poor move on their point. The people who created Wolverine did not get a cut of what he earns from Marvel Comics. This led to a lot of issues back and forth between artists and writers and comic book companies, because what they essentially would do is they'd make a comic book, 30 pages. Most of them had to draw 3 comic books a month to make ends meet, especially if you were living in the middle of New York. And that would be 90 pages of drawing and writing a month. So they knew a ton of money was being made off these comics, and they were getting barely anything for all their creative work. Then you start to see the rise of the independent publishers. People like R. Crumb, who this is probably the only stuff of his I can show you in class because most of it's pretty X-rated. Were just weird little snippets of anything that came into his head. Most of what came into his head wasn't very nice. And it was sold. It couldn't be sold at the counter because it was too X-rated. You had to go to an adult bookstore to buy a comic book that necessarily wasn't an erotic comic book. It was just kind of gross. Eventually, he would go on to illustrate the book of Genesis from the Bible. I don't know if he was feeling guilty later, but he made a comic straight up, word for word, off the Bible. And now I believe he is living in France. He's still alive. Other people started printing their comic books by sending them to a printer and then mailing them out. Wendy and Richard Penny created ElfQuest. ElfQuest only came out 3 times a year because it took them 4 months to draw and get published the comic. So you would sit around and wait for a catalog from Warp Graphics, and you would see if a new issue of ElfQuest was out, and then you'd write them a check and you'd mail them a check, and then in 6 weeks they would mail you a comic book. And you would sit around and reread that comic book about 5 times that night because you had waited for so long for that stupid thing. They were making close to $500,000 a year out of their garage selling comic books. And that's not even at the newsstands. That's mail order, which means people had to really put an effort into buying an issue. So the independent comic publishers started to take over. Well, they didn't take over, but anybody who wanted to make big money started looking at independent comics. In the 90s, you have a guy by the name of Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld. All these guys were very well-known artists within Marvel Comics at that time. And Todd McFarlane drew Spider-Man, and his fan base was huge. People loved his artwork. And at one point, they got sick of getting their monthly check. And so they went in and they complained. They said, you know, we're only getting this much a month and we're going to quit. And the publisher said, no, you can't renegotiate your contract till next month. They go, no, we're quitting. We're just straight up quitting. And they left. They started their own comic book company called Image. And the first issue of Spawn was printed and sold. Todd McFarlane made $1,200,000 off one issue of Spawn because the company didn't get to keep the money. The artist writer did. Think about that. One comic book, $1,200,000. In his first year, he made $18 million drawing Spawn. Then a couple of years, he had bought a toy company that made Spawn toys. I mean, he bought a toy company. Later on, he would go to buy a winning NASCAR so he could drive a NASCAR around his neighborhood. It's a little weird, but he had the cash. Spent $4 million for a winning baseball for one of the World Series. Tom McFarlane did very well for himself. Now, a lot of the artists that worked for Image Comics would eventually go back to Marvel, but instead of making, $1,800 paycheck a month, they ended up getting like $50,000 per issue. So if you're popular enough and you got the fan base, there's a lot of money to be made in comic books. And plus, if you own the rights, you can sell them to Netflix. They can make a TV show out of it, or maybe if it's popular enough, they'll make a movie. So a lot of times when I have this discussion with people, they're like, why are you teaching us about comic books in an art class? Shouldn't you be teaching us about famous painters? Well, I do. But famous painters didn't make the kind of money that is possible in comic books. I mean, there's a couple. Sure, Pablo Picasso did. Salvador Dali did. A lot of the famous abstract expressionist painters had to live painting to painting because their stuff was critically great. People talked about it, but nobody wanted to pay money for it. So if you're considering what to do with your life and you like making up stories and you like drawing characters, and you might someday think about being a movie maker, comic books could be the place to start for you guys. All right. That was my little brief history of the comic books. Dates that you need to know. 1938, first superhero, Superman. 1939, Batman. 1940, Wonder Woman. 1962, Spider-Man. And then I'll have some questions about creative artist rights and what kind of money can be made by comic book artists. All right. Any questions about any of that stuff? All right. Okie dokie. Have a good day. Keep on drawing, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.